I want to let you in on a secret. As I started this podcast in 2022, I knew that I would have to keep looking for a steady stream of guests. It goes with the territory. After all, it's called Dialogues with Creators, not a monologue with yours truly. So I'm always on the lookout for creators and creative people to host and talk to. If you have any suggestions, send me an email with their name. Recently, I met someone at a local event, and I'm very happy he agreed to come on and talk to a relative stranger about his work. Stay tuned for a conversation you won't forget about power, fear, and religion. This podcast is about different kinds of creators and creativity. Our tagline is, creativity comes in surprising, unexpected ways. That means we don't just talk to artists, but other types of creators to discuss other types of creativity. In this podcast, we are conversing with a gentleman who lives in Dalton, Georgia, and who created an amazing book. I've been enthralled reading this book, but I've also been deeply saddened. Why? Because it tells the true, very well-researched story of some people who used their own form of creativity, if you can call it that, to hurt a lot of people. And it bothers me for a deeper reason. I believe God is the creator of all things, and that through our relationship with God through Christ, we can enjoy creativity to the fullest. But sometimes that God-given creativity can be overlooked, misused, or abused. My guest today is Mr. David Cady, author of Religion of Fear, The True Story of the Church of God of the Union Assembly. Hello, David.
Hey, how are you today? Thank you for asking me.
I'm great, and I am so excited to be talking to you on this podcast, and I think we'll get a lot of listens to this one. I would like to start today with, of course, I have so many questions, but with why of this book, why did you write it, or the background and your interest, then the how of you writing it and getting it published, which is fascinating in itself. And then we'll get into some of the what or the content of the book and what you learned and wrote about, which is a lot. Is that okay?
That's fine. That'd be great.
Okay. So could you tell me something about your career background, et cetera, and what you're doing now?
Okay. I taught at Dalton. I taught in Florida for a while, and I moved to Dalton, but I was raised in Dalton. So I was only gone while I was in college and then taught in Florida, and then came back to Dalton High School as a science teacher. A lot of people said I should taught history because that's my hobby. But I taught for 32 years at Dalton High School. And then I taught at Phoenix High School, which is an adult high school, for 8 years after that. And all the time I've been a writer. I'd actually had always wanted to do it. And then when I turned 50, I said, you better get started. So I wrote my first book, which, I thought all you had to do was write something and send it off. And I didn't know how hard it was to get published.
Yep.
I've got a big filing cabinet, and I've saved all of the rejections for that one. But then I wrote one that, by the help of a guy named Gene Gabriel Moore, who edited from Peach Street Publishing, and it was about snake handling.
Oh.
And it's called The Handler, and I actually made it into a novel, and instead of a true story. So that's what started me writing, and that's actually what led to this one, because a guy named Zach Norville contacted me. Zach's daughter is Debbie Norville,
right,
who's a former student of mine, and he called me in his office. I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself or not, but this other book had been quite successful, The Handler, which came out in 2007, and it was nominated for book of the year at the Georgia Writers Association. And Zach called me in, so wanted me to come to his office. And of course, I didn't know why. And he says, I've got an idea for you. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to write a book about the carpet industry because of his work. And I reluctantly went, and he had bought Jesse Jr., who is one of the cult leaders. Later on, he bought his house down on the Dugout Road, and he says, "I want you to write a book about the Church of God Union Assembly." And I thought, "Oh my goodness, how am I going to do this?" And that, and he said, "Well, I've got one person I want you to go talk to." So he sent me there, and it just started from there. And for 5 years, I've researched this book.
Okay. So it started in 2007? You started the research, or?
Yeah. Well, not probably about 2010.
Okay.
That's when it started. And I kind of went at it backwards because I didn't know a lot. Even though I grew up close to where the main church was. The main church was in Dalton, Georgia. They call it the headquarters. And that's where the head of the church stayed, but he had satellite churches in 19 states, I think about 48 churches. But I grew up, could see it from my front porch to church, and did not know all this was going on when I was a little boy. And I knew they were different because they didn't allow the women to cut their hair. They could not wear makeup. The only jewelry they could wear was wedding ring. And sometimes they had to throw that in a collection plate because that was very important, the collection. And they had to wear long dresses, and they had to, the women, it was really, they treated women, I finally found out, like cattle. They were very, very tough on their women. They could not use doctors. They had to go to midwives, and these midwives were not trained, and a lot of people died. And I didn't know all this was going on until I started researching it. Wow.
So you mentioned you were a teacher at Dalton High, you said?
Right.
So you didn't probably run up against too many students because you said they were discouraged from continuing their education.
Right.
Yeah.
And the ones I had, they were very quiet. Basically, the members are very nice people. It was the people teaching them. I mean, they were using them for wealth.
Yes.
That was the bad part.
Yeah. You mentioned about the way the women dressed. Actually, I'm sure you know this, that in the holiness tradition, the Church of God tradition, that's the way it used to be for everybody, pretty much. You don't see it much anymore. But it was, when I read it, being aware of that, I said, but this is like that on steroids or something. Yeah. All of those old-timey parts of fundamentalist and holiness things, like to the max and then some, and then of course as you get into the book, it's not even that, it's just something so extreme and so disturbing that it's it bears no resemblance to anything I've really experienced. And I come from some conservative background, but oh my, it was very concerning. So that's interesting. And I appreciate your transparency about that, because that was one of the main questions I had was, as we mentioned in our talk beforehand, that it seemed like these things were going on, and not just here, but all over the country, really. They had branches in Indiana and Ohio and Texas and other southern states and things like that.
And Detroit.
Yeah. Wow. Detroit. And that they were just kind of under the radar so much in terms of, occasionally they'd get in trouble with the law, but it seemed that they got away with a lot of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So I was just interested in reading about that, being kind of not new to Dalton, but just not having lived here my life, that this was going on, and so many people didn't know about it, which is interesting. But just as a side note, I think we can be that way. We can be so much into our lives that we don't sometimes know what's going on with other people. One time I was teaching my students we were reading something, and I said that this professor was at Morehouse College, and nobody knew where that was in the class. And I said, it's in Atlanta. Don't know where but it's historically Black school, and they were all white. So they just didn't know about historically Black schools. So we can get very into our little worlds sometimes. So
University of Tennessee's wanted me to write a book, which I don't have time for right now. I taught my first year at an all-Black school. And I have a lot of stories because that was in 1968, and that's when Martin Luther King was killed. And I had a lot, and Vietnam War was going on. And they're pushing me to write that, but I'm going to have to wait.
Yeah. Going back also, you said about the snake handling book, The Handler, and that was a novel. But there was a nonfiction book, Salvation on Sand Mountain. Do you know that book? Yeah.
Oh, I researched that book.
Okay. Yeah. And I haven't read it. I hate snakes, so I'm not going to read about snakes. But
during the Waco thing too, so I combined those stories together.
I see. Okay.
And use things that really happened in two different areas, and combined it into one story.
Yeah.
So that's the one. Mine takes place on Sand Mountain, but Raccoon Mountain, which was a continuation of Sand Mountain.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. The Waco thing. Oh, that was so horrible. That was sad too. So I should tell the listeners that I met Mr. Cady, David, at a local authors fair at the Dalton Whitfield Library on April 1st. He was right next to me, sort of, in the setup, and he was the most popular author there. And it's partially because of who he is and his personality, but also his book about the Church of God of the Union Assembly. So when it comes right down to it, why did you feel led to write this book?
Well, once I got into it, I wasn't really gung-ho on it at first because I was in the middle of another book, which was a sequel to The Handler. And I was halfway finished writing through with it, which was a sequel, I said. And when Mr. Norval called me in, and so he sent me to, actually, it was Charlie Carmichael at Dalton he sent me to. And Charlie just died just recently, but his dad was a minister there and was second in command. And then Jesse threw him out. And so Charlie gave me about 4 or 5 interviews, and then he suggested people that I go see. And, when I'd have time, I would go see some of these people. It took me a while they would throw out names that I didn't know who they were talking about. Mm-hmm. So I had to start writing things down and get me boards and timelines and trying to organize all that. And I love doing that kind of research anyway. And so I said, well, I better start recording these. So I started and I recorded 90% of everything so that I'd have backup. And so one thing led to another. One interesting thing, when I would try to talk to people, and I learned this about people, and they would say, I just don't want to talk about that. I said, I can't talk about it. And I said, and sometimes it'd be over the phone. Sometimes I'd go see them. And of course, a lot of them lived in Indiana and California, and I'd have to call. And they would say, I'm not going to talk about it. And I said, oh, okay, I understand. I understand you went through a lot. And he said, you don't know what I went through. I said, well, I know a little bit. And then we'd have a 2-hour conversation.
Oh, my word. Bless their hearts.
Me everything that happened to me. And I would say, well, can I use this? And some of them said no, and I didn't use it. So, and then eventually people started saying, yeah, go ahead and use it. I don't care. And poor one lady who was in it, she was a former member, and all of her friends were members of that church, and they actually ostracized her for me she allowed me to put her name in this, and she passed away just past year. So it's been very interesting.
Yeah. Well, and I want to say, I'm going to put these 2 links in the show notes for the podcast about your experience at the Southern Festival of Books, and the a couple other another link too, and that struck me. You had some folks there at that panel who were you had talked to, and one lady was asked about if she had to go through therapy, and she was very transparent about it. And I just have to wonder, what was the amassed therapy bills for counseling that those folks have had to go through over the last 30 so years, because I imagine that the older people from back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they didn't have counseling. People didn't worry about that stuff then. So they just suffered in silence. But at least now people can get some survivor therapy kind of things. Did you run into that a lot, that there were a lot of people had therapy or counseling?
And in fact, after my book, I didn't think about that until I started. We had a big show up at UT in Knoxville when the book came out, and we had a book signing at one of the local book clubs stores up there. And so a lot of the members came, and they formed the Survivors web page. And of course, you have to be a former member, and they said that's going to let me be in it. And anyway, getting to your question, a lot of them have post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. And I always get confused when I try to say that in an acronym. But we went out to eat, and we were eating at this Italian restaurant, and one of the women went into the restroom and came back out, and she was just real fidgety, and she had got a trigger. And I didn't even know about this when I wrote the book, but she smelled Lysol in the bathroom, and that triggered her because they were not allowed to use any anesthesia, any aspirins, anything. So for women hygiene, they were encouraged to use Lysol.
Oh, my.
And so that's another thing. It wasn't even in my book because when I wrote it, I didn't even know about this.
Oh, how horrid. How horrid. I may have to put a trigger warning on this podcast because that's disturbing. And there was that other story that the woman told on the at the Southern Festival of Books was just horrible. I was so sad. So I'm very interested and impressed by the fact that this was published by the University of Tennessee Press, because someone like me, who's always worked in higher ed, that's a big deal to get published by an academic university press. So I'd like to know how that happened.
Well, I had not quite finished the book, and I had made friends with a guy, Dr. Rouse Hood, who teaches at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. He's a religious psychologist. Yes. And that's what he teaches. And so he was interested in it. And his hobby was these snake handlers in the Appalachian Mountain area. Mm-hmm. And so he wanted to read my book. And so he read that one. And then I said, well, I'm writing one on the Church of God Union Assembly. And he said, well, when you finish it, I want to read it. So I hadn't finished it. And when I finished it, I took it up there and we went out to eat, and I gave it to him. And he said, I'll talk to you a week from today. And it was on a Thursday. Well, he called me on Sunday and said, I've already finished it. Oh, yeah. And it was 150 pages longer than the book is now. And he says, you got to get this published, and I'm going to help you get it published. And Ralph had 9 books published. And so I sent it to Mercer and used his name. Mm-hmm. And so after about a month, I hadn't heard anything back from Mercer, and he kept saying, "Have you heard anything back?" So I called Mercer. I know you're not supposed to do this, but I said, I called them.
Right.
And they said, "Well, we've looked at it here," and it was a hard copy. And they said, "This is too big for us to handle. We hadn't even read it." And so that's a lot of things that happen to you in the publishing.
Yes, so, I know.
And so he said, "Well, let's just send it to UT, and I'll make a recommendation." So UT had it for over a year before they said that they were going to publish. Mm-hmm. And finally, they called me one day and said, "We're going to publish this thing, but we need to make some changes." And those changes lasted about a year and a half.
Oh, okay.
And it was basically the changes, though, were to protect me and to protect themselves. And because I had a lot of stuff in there about psychologically, I tried to research how these people are affected psychologically and how people could get into cults. And UT said, "Well, you're not a psychiatrist. You cannot make these claims." So we had to take all that out.
Yeah.
And everything that a lot of stuff that I had researched. So that's how I got into it, was through Dr. Hood.
Okay. So that's amazing. So you sent it to them about 2017 and it was 2019 when it came out?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's it. Everything takes longer than it should. But an academic publisher is going to be even slower than a non-academic, I guess. Have you thought about repackaging or redoing those parts they edited out and doing the book as a different kind of thing, more of a oral history, more of a personal kind of thing than as a historical academic thing?
Well, I have. In fact, we had talked about taking just the interviews and do just the interviews. Mm-hmm. And they thought it would be very good for religious students.
Yes. Yes.
And we're talking about that. Mm-hmm. But I've already got involved in another book, which I'm more than half finished now. And we'll talk about that later if you want to. But I probably will. UT has asked me to do that, but I'll probably. Okay. Of course, they got to accept it too. It's just because you've been published once doesn't mean anything. You got to meet their standards.
Well, there's so much more awareness now of spiritual abuse in authoritarian kinds of church settings, and I'm by no means an expert, but I've read a lot of that, and a lot of it nowadays centers around sexual abuse. And although that was part of the situation you were writing about, it wasn't, and it was definitely a part of it, but it wasn't, it seemed like it was more financial abuse in some ways, that they just took everything. It wasn't a tithe, 10%, typical Baptist thing. It was everything. And to the extent, I don't know how those people lived.
They didn't much.
Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, one of the things he would tell them is, of course, this is, I guess, in the book, if 10% is all that belongs to God, then you're not giving God what he needs, because he needs everything.
God doesn't need anything.
You can't just give 10%. He would say 10% is not in the Bible. You're supposed to give everything. Everything belongs to God. Of course, then he told him he was God, so he got everything.
Yes. And that was, oh boy. So just one more question about so it was basically a 7-year process to write the book.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So for those of you out there who think you can write a book in a month, it won't be any good. It won't be as good as David's. All right. So, so we've already, started to get into this, and I also did want to mention that you had, we'll give a link to this, that you were invited to the Southern Festival of Books in 2019, which is a big deal, people. And you can see that that panel discussion he was on and some of the folks from the church who spoke, and it was quite moving. So now I want to get into the what. I know that some of your book is controversial to some people, to say the least. Well, we could go into that, but like I said, it amazed and it disturbed me. I think to give kind of a framework, my understanding that in 1917, a gentleman who was not really a preacher, but he sort of was. He wasn't ordained in the sense we think of today. He was kicked out of one Church of God sect, and he started his own sect. Was that what you would say? Yeah. And his name was C.T. Pratt, or Charles T. Pratt. And he seemed to fumble around for a while in the 20s until it really took off with his new church. And he had a lot of kids, and he was illiterate. And his wife was literate, and she was sort of the power, it seemed like, as far as getting him to to know the Bible. She'd read the Bible to him, and he'd memorize it and things like that. And then, so he was in charge, and then his son in the 40s, Jesse Pratt, took over through some finagling, and then he died in 74. Right. And his son, and these aren't always the oldest son, but his son, Jesse Jr., who had apparently some trouble with the law, right? He seemed to have been discharged from the service. He took over, and he was, so the two Jessies took it even further in, it seemed like C.T. Pratt he was wrong, but he wasn't so wrong. But then the Jessies really went crazy. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of the overview picture? Yeah. Okay.
I think C.T. kind of meant right when he started the church. I think, I think he had no plans to form this strong, and, they don't want you to use the word cult anymore. Right. They want you to use corrosive behavior, persuasion, and but that's according to Dr. Hood. But CT was illiterate. He was an alcoholic, and it seemed like that followed in all his children too.
Yeah, yeah.
Jesse Jr. died of cirrhosis of the liver when he was 55 years old, and so then there's been wars and counter wars. Who's going to take over the church after that? But CT did mean well, but he got a hold of that money, and he learned how to use the money. And I interviewed a former United States Congressman, Irwin Mitchell, who had served in Washington, and he had dealings with C.T. Pratt, and I'd interviewed Irwin because he had had to sue Jesse basically because of lack of child support from his first wife. But he told me that CT was, and the story that happened to Irwin is in the book, that CT was illiterate, could not read, but he was one of the smartest men that he had ever been around. So he had common sense, and knew how to finagle people. And that's basically, and he got worse as his son got older. Jesse, who was his fifth son, basically. Mm-hmm. But it's, everybody thinks it's the oldest child, but it was his fifth son.
Right.
Took over.
And there was some discussion in the book that Jesse T. Pratt, right, the middle one, he was bipolar. And from his behavior, I would say some other things too, but I'm, again, not a psychiatrist, but he, definitely some paranoia there. But because he could be so charming And obviously people followed him, but then he was just violently evil people.
Yeah, that was told to me by 4 or 5 different people I interviewed. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of them that I interviewed told me, I said, well, how do you know he was bipolar? He says, because I'm bipolar. He says, I was diagnosed with it. Mm-hmm. So, and then some other people, a lot of people said this. And so I never met him, so I don't know,
Yeah. So I'll let you at this point, as far as, what you want to say about the content of the book and maybe how it affected you personally, because I'm kind of interested in that. I have a hard time calling it a church because it doesn't bear a lot of relationship to what I consider church, but to me, it's just a sect, unfortunately. And I could call it the other word, but I won't since I'm not supposed to. So, as you were learning these things, and you can talk about what you learned, I'm interested in how it affected you personally.
Well, it did. In fact, it affected my wife too and my whole family. And so when I was in the middle of it and she was finding out some of the stuff, she told me she's never done anything like this. And right in the middle of my research, she says, "You're not going to write this book, are you?" And I said, "Yeah, I plan to." And she just, "Oh, please don't write this book." I said, "Well, I'll think about it." So basically, secretly, I just went ahead and kept doing my work. Mm-hmm. Because here's what she saw. There would be lots of times once I got into it and people found out I was doing it, especially former members from all over the country. This seemed to happen on Sunday. I'd get a call and Dave says, "I'm so-and-so and I live in Kokomo, Indiana, and I want to tell you my story." And there would be times that I would hear their story, and I was recording it all the time, that it would just tear me up to hear what they had to say. And that would put me in a kind of a sad mood. Oh. And that's how it affected me. And then, of course, I started getting threats once it got to the point that it was going to come out and everybody started talking about it. And we basically were worried about, repercussions, violent repercussions. Mm-hmm. And when I went out for a while, I hate to say this, but I got a permit to carry because I had been threatened so many times, carry a weapon. And I don't do that, but I could if I wanted to, because there were some violent threats against me.
Right.
And anyway, that's how it affected me.
What were they? Was it because they had done something, or was it because of family members had done these things, or they just didn't want it known that they had been connected with that group?
Well, yes, all of that.
Okay.
All of that. For example, I had a call from a young man in Texas, and his father, who's still alive, is in this book. And he told me, he says, "My grandfather, are you going to write anything about my grandfather?" And I said, "Well, I hate to tell you, but I am." And the book was already at UT. We were in like the the final proofing, and so I read it to him, and it was about his dad, who was one of the C.T. Pratt's grandchildren, but his name wasn't Pratt, who had beat up a guy, and the guy had stayed in a coma at church. In a coma for a week. And this happened in the 70s. And so the guy said, "Well, my grandfather said this didn't happen because I wrote what I said. I said, really? He said that didn't happen. So I said, well, would you like for me to send you an article out of the Dalton paper that talks about it? Mm-hmm. So he said, yes, I'd really like to see that. So I made a scan of it and sent it to him, and I haven't heard a word from him since, because the articles in the Dalton paper talked about exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And even more than I had put in the book. And, so that's the kind of stuff. And then, people's tried to trick me and call me and not really be who they say they are, and try to get me to say things. And I have to be very, very careful about, saying things that not true. Like UT made me, if it wasn't a personal experience by somebody, I had to have two sources for everything that I put in the book.
Right. So and it is very well sourced. I mean, it's got, it looks like 50 pages of footnotes or citations. So, in the video at the Southern Festival of Books, that very nice looking young woman got up at the end and said that she's still in the church. And listening to her, I think she was disturbed by what had been said. It struck me that she was like, I'm sorry this happened to you all. It hasn't been my experience, but it seemed like she was affected by it. Like, maybe I need to rethink this. Do you remember who I'm talking about? Nice looking girl with, with long dark hair. And
I got a letter from her boyfriend a little bit later, and he apologized for all of that. So I said, well, no problem.
Yeah. So, the other thing I think that also I think is hard maybe for somebody living in 2023, and we're so full of ourselves and everything, is understanding why people were attracted to this. Why people followed, especially Jesse, the, CT's son. It was why they were taken up in that. And to some extent, it was the fella at the panel said that they were born into it, and they were told we're not gonna so much get converts. We're just gonna make our own converts by having 12 kids, that kind of thing. And so they were born into it, and they didn't really know anything else. That was how church was supposed to be. That was how religion was supposed to be. Did you find that they were very good at getting converts? People from, say, who were not religious at all, or who were Methodist, Baptist, or something, who decided to become this thing? Or did they just kind of get their own types of people?
Well, they got their own kind of people. And the only converts they would get is if somebody was going to get married to a person who was not a member of the church, then that person had to join the church and be a member for 6 months before they would allow them to get married. Or they had to leave the church. And the sad part of it, and I don't think we've talked about it, is some of these people that left the church were never permitted to see their family again who stayed in the church. And one man who helped me an awful lot with this thing, Charles Roberts, he didn't even get to see his grandmother for 30 years, and she died without him ever getting to see her. And that's because they were not permitted to. And if they did, then they were called up in church and ostracized right in front of everybody. And rebuking, and we haven't said anything about
right. So, I wanted you to go ahead on the rebuking stuff and the fear. Yeah, go ahead.
It was, I didn't see it, but I heard so much about it that was started by Jesse. CT, as far as I know, I could never find out that he ever rebuked anybody. But once Jesse became a minister in the church in the 40s, during World War II. And the reason he didn't go into the war was because he only had one eye. And so he been splitting wood, and a splinter went in his eye, and he pulled it out himself. Of course, they didn't go to doctors or anything.
Yeah.
Lost it. But Jesse started what they call rebuking. Of course, rebuking is in the Bible, but he did it he carried it like everything else, just a little farther. And he started laying hands on people's heads and just jerking them around, and violently shaking their heads. And this wouldn't be for a few seconds. This may go on for an hour. And I even know some people that have had permanent damage to their necks and stuff from this. And people would throw up. Women would, and here we are on a podcast, but they would sometimes, a lot of times, the women would wet themselves while they were being rebuked, and their dresses would fly over their heads. And one woman was rebuked when she was 8 months pregnant. And of course, she didn't lose the baby, but it was quite violent. One man, he always prepared them, Jesse did, and this is in the book. Jesse always would start hammering somebody while he was preaching. And he would say, so-and-so, you're not doing right. It was usually another preacher. You're not bringing in enough money. You're just caring about yourself. And of course, the rebuking's coming. And this happened in the 60s or 70s. I can't remember now. But when Jesse went to rebuke him, he fell over on the floor and he was dead. He was in his 50s, and he died of a heart attack right there in the service. And this is how powerful everything was. And why nobody else would come in is they locked the doors at that time. And if you went down there, and there's people said they went down there, then they would invite you to sit on the front row. And if you got in before they locked them, and they wouldn't kick them out, but they would kick out former members if they didn't like how they were acting. But in fact, they didn't just say you leave. They'd pick them up bodily and throw them out the door. But there was a lot of fear. It was basically a fear factor. That's how they operated. And got all their money, and they had no other choice.
Right. Yeah. And to be honest, we've only gotten into a few areas. I mean, the money thing just blew me away. How much money they amassed from these poor people that they basically treated like slaves, in many respects. They were enslaved, and which I don't know how they got away with it from the IRS. They were very clever at cheating the IRS, it seemed to me, although they did get caught sometimes. And we also haven't even touched on the sexual abuse aspects of it. The one fella that was in Indiana, that I'm not going to say his name because he was a bad person, but and then the you're going to marry her, and the wife swapping kind of thing, and all that stuff that was just. It was just that these three men had and I guess their family members as well, had so much power that the people had given them. And because ultimately the people gave it to them, I guess, they allowed them to do this. And some walked away, but so many wouldn't.
Well, if you walked away, you were going to lose your family. And of course, some of them were bold enough to walk away. A lot of them were bold enough to walk away. And, it was a sad situation. They're supposed to be different now. I mean, they're allowing them to cut their hair, and they're allowing them to go to doctors. But at one time, they even if you lived in Indiana, you had to come to Whitfield, Murray County,
Yeah.
And around here, we call it Murray.
Yeah. More.
Murray County. But they had a birthing center over there, and it's still there. And the women would go in there, and actually, it was CT's daughter who did two of her daughters and one other woman who would actually, they were untrained, literate, and a lot of the babies died. And a lot of the women, not a lot, but some of the women died. And I talked to people who ran funeral homes, and they would say, my goodness, we were going over there all the time picking up dead babies, dead women who died. Of course, they kept this a secret, and the reason they could keep it a secret is from fear again. They could not talk about it. And if a kid, say, well, a kid wouldn't be fearful, but if a kid did something, then the parents would be rebuked. And so the children didn't want their parents to get into trouble, so everybody stayed quiet about it. But they're supposed to be different now.
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, it's your last chapter is about that pretty much, I think. About since maybe the mid-90s, how it's been a little different. But there's still a lot of people with, like you say, PTSD. I suppose that
some of the people that talk to me recently, and I have them talk to me all the time, and they say that some of them are still trying to go back to that, and tell them if you're ever a member here and you leave, then you're not going to heaven. They're going to the other place.
Oh, wow.
And so they're still, and that's what they're telling me. They're saying that they're still, if you don't go to that church, then and then one guy said, well, what about these people who's never been members? And they said, well, they're okay, but if you've ever been a member here and heard the word, then you can't leave,
Yeah. And, that was funny because, I didn't catch a lot of real theology in any of the things that these people said. Their theology and their biblical hermeneutics and, all that stuff was pretty weird. It was pretty out there. And that's, you said that those Jesse especially really took the place of God, and in the, in the way people treated him and everything, along with a lot of other stuff. And this, there was another area that, another subject matter that, along with the lack of theology, that, there's just so much. So I'll let you continue about anything you want to say about the book.
Okay. I guess there's been some deaths in the thing, like when Jesse died.
Yeah.
In 1974, that I have heard everything that could possibly happen to him. To tell the story when people hadn't read the book, Jesse and his wife Irene were separated. And of course, you were not allowed to get a divorce in there until Jesse and Irene met each other. And then they both had 3 children. And I think one of them only had 2. And they slipped off to Arizona. Somewhere out there where you can get a divorce quick. And they got a divorce and came back in. Well, later on in 1974, Irene and him had already had 5 children. And he was going to separate from Irene. And he went over he was living in Murray County again at one of their farms. They owned a bunch of farms. And he was going over and he told some people that he was going to tell Irene that they were going to separate. Well, that night, about 4:00 in the morning, the funeral home, who's a good friend of mine, who went over and picked him up, picked Jesse up. And Jesse, they listed it as a heart attack, but Jesse had bled out. He had a gash in his head. Yeah. And he had bled out all over the floor, and some of the people were trying to clean the blood up out of the floor. And the coroner listed it. I have his death certificate listed as a heart attack, but basically, and the guy who embalmed him, I talked to him, said he didn't have a pound of blood in him when they embalmed him. But that was a big mystery. And I've had all kinds of tales. People tell me that they were there, but I didn't put a lot of that in there because I could prove it. And I don't know what happened. There's a lot of people think they know, but there's still people alive that were there that night. There were 9 people there staying in the house when this happened. Yeah. And some of them are still alive. But
well, and in relation to that, the Jesse person, the first son, he had, and that's a story in itself. The way he took control from his father, and what I found also very interesting was that I learned a lot about Dalton's history, and I would recommend it to people just to learn about Dalton's history. And Don West, he was a character. I've only become recently aware of him, the alleged communist who was trying to be an activist, I guess, up here at the with the textile workers union. And I did not know there was ever a textile workers union in Dalton, but that was back in the 30s. And I guess it kind of went away in the 40s. And I guess when Don West left, they kind of went away, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Your work in that is fascinating. That was like a whole other thing. And I was like, I didn't know any of this stuff. And that C.T. Pratt was in with him, and that they were working together, which but it seemed to be that it was like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of a thing, that Don West was able to use him, and C.T. was able to use Don West to get money out of these poor folks. Is that what you would say?
That's right. I know UT, the director of the UT Press is the one who edited my book, and himself. And he called me one day and he said, "You knew Don West? You've written about Don West." I did. Don West, pretty famous person, evidently.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. There was quite a story. He was here for a couple of years, and I have a lot of information about him. He said, "Well, that's going to be worth it right there, just publishing the book." So, but I don't know whether Don West was a communist. He claimed to be at a time. The story how he got here, they started their own newspaper. And by the way, I was able to get copies of that newspaper from the University of Georgia. And so I did. And what they had in there told me a lot of the history of it.
Yeah.
But going back to why I wrote about Dalton, because I guess I knew more about it and there was more about this, but CT took over, or he formed this church in Dalton, and he formed it actually in 1918 down in Cassville, which Cass Station, which is not there anymore, but it's White. I think it's called White Church. Yeah. And he came to Whitfield County because Whitfield County was a farming community. And then the textile industry moved in here actually making cotton thread. And it became Crown Cotton Mill, which was the big one, and then American Thread and a few others. And this is in like 1918, 1920. And so CT moved up here because he saw a market for his church. Because all these people were moving in here from farms, and they built, that back then like the companies would have houses, and that would be their village, and they'd
mill village.
Rent the homes to their workers, because you got to realize people had to walk to work, so they had to live close. Wasn't a lot of cars, and you couldn't leave your horse outside while you were working. So CT saw the I'm just saying this from my research.
Yeah.
He saw what was happening. And he did this in all these other towns, and he got a huge membership because these people were coming in here. Most of them were illiterate, and he was able to, at first, he helped them. During the Depression, he actually gave away food, and he was able to raise food, and it turned great dividends for him later on when World War II started. And everybody's, I think they made parachutes around here, and I didn't even put that. That was one of the big things in tents and so forth. But that's why I wrote so much about Dalton, because that was just an example of how he was able to form this church. And from then on, it was just, you were born into it,
Okay. That is fascinating. And so, folks, you need to get this book. It is, please, you need to know it is I don't want to say it's a fast read. It reads like a novel, but it is incredibly well researched and amazing. So I really recommend you get this book and read it. It's got so many things that a group could talk about, a book discussion group could talk about, a church group could talk about. I think it would be a great thing for a church group to talk about, and relationship to spiritual abuse and how people get off the track of theology and things like that. I mean, it's I'm just so glad that you've written this and that you were able to talk to me today. So,
but it is on its second printing now.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And so they're running out of it at Amazon now. And I think all the major bookstores run out of it, not ordered any, because they ran out of them at one time. But they reprinted it. So,
is it available on Kindle or an ebook?
Yeah, no.
It's not. Okay.
In fact, I have it. It's been made already into an Audible book.
Oh.
And it's already been done that, but it hadn't been gone through the process yet.
Oh, they really need to put it as a Kindle, because people, I think you would get more.
I tried to talk them, but they still got some books to sell, and so
Oh, well,
exactly, they're wanting it as a supplemental textbook, basically. You tell you what.
Yeah. Okay.
A research book.
Well, again, thank you for being with us today, Mr. David Cady of Dalton, Georgia. Wonderful writer.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.